You know, there are some conflicts that just define a generation. They tear nations apart and leave scars that honestly are still felt today. For almost 20 years, the Vietnam War was, well, it was everywhere. But it's still one of the most complex, most misunderstood wars of the 20th century. So in this explainer, we're going to try to unravel the key moments and the big ideas that really shaped this war and its incredible legacy.
And that complexity, well, it starts with the name itself. Here in the West, we call it the Vietnam War. Simple enough. But in Vietnam, the official name is the Resistance War Against America to Save the Nation. That difference isn't just a small detail. It's a huge window into the two profoundly different ways of seeing this entire conflict. So to really get to the bottom of those two perspectives, we've got to rewind the clock, way back. Because to understand the American war in Vietnam, you first have to understand the decades of colonial struggle that came before it even started.
Okay, so picture this. After a long, brutal war to finally kick out their French colonial rulers, Vietnam is right on the edge of independence. But then, the 1954 Geneva Accords come along and basically slice the country in two. In the north, you get a communist government led by this revolutionary hero, Ho Chi Minh, and in the south, you get an anti-communist government propped up by the US. Now, this whole division was supposed to be temporary, with elections to reunify the country planned for 1956.
So why did the US get so deeply involved in the conflict halfway around the world? Well, it all boils down to one powerful idea: the domino theory. The folks in Washington were absolutely convinced that if South Vietnam fell to communism, its neighbors, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, they'd all topple one by one, just like dominoes. In their minds, this wasn't just about Vietnam. It was a critical front in the global Cold War against the Soviet Union.
But here's where it gets really complicated. While the US was terrified of a communist takeover, the leader of the communists, Ho Chi Minh, was a national hero. I mean, he was widely loved for defeating the French. In fact, even President Eisenhower admitted in private that if those 1956 elections had actually happened, Ho would have wanted a landslide, with something like 80% of the vote. And because the US-backed leader in the South knew this, he blocked the elections, which basically set the stage for war. All right, so with a peaceful, democratic solution now completely off the table, the conflict starts to heat up. And America's role begins to grow, not with some big invasion, but through this slow, creeping escalation. In the beginning, under President Eisenhower, there were fewer than 1,000 U.S. military advisors in Vietnam. Then President Kennedy came in and bumped that up to over $16,000. But it was President Johnson who really went all in, committing America to a full-scale war and sending the number of troops skyrocketing to a peak of over 500,000. The real turning point was this kind of murky incident in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964. A U.S. destroyer said it was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And this thing was basically a blank check. It gave President Johnson the power to wage war in Vietnam without ever formally declaring one. And that just opened the floodgates for a massive deployment of U.S. troops.
And with those floodgates wide open, America unleashed its incredible air power. Operation Rolling Thunder was this relentless, 3-year bombing campaign that dropped 1 million tons of explosives on North Vietnam. The goal was pretty simple: bomb the North into giving up and cut off all their support for the Southern Communist guerrillas, known as the Viet Cong.
Meanwhile, on the ground, the U.S. commander, General William Westmoreland, he laid out a 3-phase plan. Phase 1, just stop the bleeding, halt the losing trend. Phase 2, launch these huge search and destroy missions to wipe out enemy forces. And Phase 3, just mop up whoever is left. The whole strategy was a war of attrition. It was based on the belief that American firepower could inflict more casualties than the North Vietnamese could possibly withstand.
For years, the American public was being told that this strategy was working, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. But then, in 1968, one single event happened that would completely shatter that story and change the entire course of the war.
Just a few months before, in late 1967, General Westmoreland had confidently said that victory was on the horizon. The U.S. government even launched this whole media campaign, a progress offensive, to convince everyone back home that the war was being won. But that optimism was about to run headfirst into a very brutal reality.
Then, during the Tet holiday, the Vietnamese New Year, the Communists did the unthinkable. They launched a massive, coordinated surprise attack on cities and towns all across South Vietnam. The scale of it was just stunning.
And for U.S. intelligence, it was a colossal failure. They just didn't see it coming. And the images, they were just shocking. You had communist commandos literally attacking the U.S. embassy in the heart of Saigon. A month-long, brutal, house-to-house battle that left the historic city of Hue in ruins. For the first time, this war wasn't in some faraway jungle. It was raging in the cities, and it was being broadcast every single night into American living rooms. And this quote from a U.S. officer explaining why they had to bomb the town of Ben Tre, it came to symbolize the awful contradictions of the war. It just perfectly captured this feeling that maybe, just maybe, the immense destruction was actually undermining the whole goal of winning over the people.
So here's the ultimate paradox of the Tet Offensive. Militarily, the attack was a disaster for the communists. They suffered horrific losses and didn't hold any ground. But politically, it was an absolutely stunning victory. For the American public, it completely shattered any illusion that the war was close to being won. And as you can see, support back home just collapsed.
After Tet, everything changed. In Washington, the conversation completely shifted. The big question was no longer, how do we win this war? It was, how do we get out?
President Richard Nixon's plan was a policy called Vietnamization. The idea was pretty straightforward. Gradually pull American troops out, while at the same time train and equip the South Vietnamese army so they could fight the war on their own. It was a strategy designed to achieve what he called peace with honor.
So in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending direct U.S. military involvement. The last American combat troops left 2 months later, but the peace was fragile. The fighting between North and South Vietnam just kept going, and without American air power to back them up, the South Vietnamese army slowly started to crumble.
That fragile peace didn't last. Just 2 years after the U.S. left, North Vietnam launched its final massive offensive. And on April 30th, 1975, the whole world watched these iconic, desperate images of helicopters evacuating people from the roof of the U.S. Embassy as North Vietnamese tanks literally crashed through the gates of the presidential palace. America's long, agonizing war was finally over.
But the war's most profound legacy, of course, is its staggering human cost. I mean, look at these numbers. While over 58,000 Americans died, that number is just dwarfed by the death toll in Southeast Asia. Estimates suggest that as many as 3 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were killed, along with hundreds of thousands more in neighboring Cambodia and Laos, where the conflict had spilled over. It's just devastating.
And the consequences just radiated outwards for decades. The fall of Saigon led to a massive refugee crisis. The land itself and generations of people were poisoned by chemical weapons like Agent Orange. And back in the United States, the conflict left these deep political scars and created something called the Vietnam Syndrome, a real skepticism of foreign military intervention that shaped U.S. policy for years and years.
So why does this war, which ended half a century ago, still matter so much? Because its echoes are literally all around us. It's this powerful, stark lesson on the limits of military power, the strength of a nation's will to resist, and the devastating human cost of ideological battles. The Vietnam War isn't just history. It's a ghost that continues to haunt and shape our world.